Imagine, if you will, the scene of the feeding of the 4,000 if it were done today. There Jesus would be after blessing and breaking the loaves, and the disciples would take it in baskets to start distributing it amongst the crowds of people who were gathered today, only to hear cries aloud of, "Is there a vegan option in the house?" Or, "I can't eat that. Is it gluten-free?" "Hey, Jesus, are there nuts in that loaf? We can't have any nuts. We got a nut allergy over here." And also, "Well, I hope that's milk-free because I'm lactose intolerant. And I certainly don't want to have a bellyache out here in the wilderness." And then those questioning the fish, "Does it have mercury in it?" How hard it would be to feed crowds today. And if anyone here is in the business of feeding a crowd, you might be able to commiserate with what Jesus would be experiencing in our cartoon version of it today. It is far more challenging to feed people today because we are more aware of dietary restrictions and preferences and needs. I'm a vegetarian and I love to eat, and so I see this issue from both sides. How difficult it can be to feed all the people, and how I like to be considered when food is being offered. Thankfully, we don't hear any complaints from the people here in the Gospel of Mark. In fact, we kind of imagine that they were probably very grateful. They had been following him for 3 days, and in fact, they had no food. And so we realize that not only are they grateful, but they are not the only people grateful for food. There are people all over the world having enough food or dealing with too much food. These are all concerns that people have today. That is what we are focusing our deliberative dialogue on. The title is called A Land of Plenty. We're asking questions such as who has food, who doesn't, and how can everyone have enough? We are looking at this question as a congregation, and ultimately we are asking, how does our faith inform thinking about access to food? This matters to us for a host of reasons. First and foremost, we all eat, right? We all need to eat to survive. That's a given. But we must consider what it means that we are surrounded on all sides of our towns with fields that produce food. We have cattle, we have corn, we have soybeans all around us. But also, in our very county, we have neighbors who struggle with having enough food. Our county has so many children living at or near the federal poverty income level that they all receive breakfast and lunch at school. And you know that we have accommodations during the summer to make sure that children and their families have food during the summer. That is why we have the Munchmobile that parks in our parking lot at the church to give children a nutritious meal when they might not have access to it. In fact, if you really think about it, out where we live in the county is a fresh food desert. There is no fresh food that we can purchase nearby. So what does it mean to us that we are an agrarian community, but if you're not growing your own food, you live in a fresh food desert? We have to drive nearly 15 miles in any direction to get to a grocery store that has fresh produce. And so I wonder, what do situations like this do to the soul of a people or to a community? I invite you to seriously consider these questions and other questions and attend our deliberative dialogue, which will occur Wednesday evenings during Lent. We will take up this issue step by step of how our land might more represent a land of plenty. There's a lot of things that I did not do right as a parent, but I will claim boldly that I think I did this one thing right. I fed my child in responsible ways. I read early on as a new parent that when a baby is ready to be introduced to solid foods, right after you do the cereal and you start going to baby food, to go to vegetables before fruit. Do any parents recognize this wisdom? Because if children taste first, they become accustomed to the sweetness in their mouth, and they start to develop a sweet palate. And then you go to shove those green beans in their mouth, and they don't want to have anything to do with it. And so my child got accustomed to eating vegetables before we introduced the sweetness of fruit. I wonder if not following this advice might be the reason why some of my friends' children do not eat a good diet at all. When I sit down to eat with their families, the children eat a steady diet of chicken nuggets, cheese pizza, and maybe a little bit of fruit, but that usually involves an argument of some sort. And to this day, I proudly proclaim that my child eats a pretty good diet for a teenager, a variety of foods, and has always enjoyed vegetables. So one day, when little Kendall was sitting at the table, there were still a few more bits of veg on the plate, and Chris was claiming to be too full to eat another bite. I didn't argue with it, because like I said, my child ate pretty good. But just a few minutes later, lo and behold, can I have some dessert? And I said, well, what about that food on your plate? You still got a few more bites of broccoli. Why don't you go ahead and eat that? Well, Chris responded, I'm all full of that. And I kind of understood what that meant. Like, I'm all full of that, but I still have room for some of that. I get the logic. And sometimes I use that excuse myself to eat things I probably shouldn't eat. What this makes me wonder is, throughout all the ways that people receive food, are they getting enough of what they need? First of all, and maybe just a little portion of also what they want. And I understand the adage, beggars can't be choosers, we say, but we're also human. And I know that certain foods appeal to me more than others. And I wonder, when we send diverse people into food pantries and they tend to come out with all the same thing, I wonder if some of them get all full of that. I've also seen food being prepared and served at shelters. And there are some well-intentioned groups, including church groups, that go there and work very hard to feed people. But I've also heard the recipients of the food grumble a little bit. They'll say, well, this is the 4th time this week that we've had spaghetti and garlic bread. And so the food might be delicious, but is it nutritious? Usually the food we serve is laden with starches, salt, and fat. And that is how some, even who live below the poverty line, can still have many health issues associated with being overweight. I also know that the highly processed and sugar and starch-laden food is cheaper. One person I know who struggles to feed her family was shopping at one of our local stores, and the cart, it was just full of stuff that most of us would kind of wag our finger at and call junk food. And I tried my best not to judge her, because I know she doesn't have much money, and I know she's got a house full of picky eaters. And I know that the local stores just don't carry much that isn't processed. And so I realize that sometimes we're all just doing the best we can with what we have. And just as Jesus had compassion on these crowds, I hope that we can muster compassion for some of the struggles that people have in finding enough food. So this is one of the questions we will consider during our deliberative dialogue. The first question is, do people have access, not to just enough food, but to enough of the right kinds of food? The second dimension that we'll consider is that food is more than just the stuff that we put in our bellies to stave off hunger. Food is an important part of our cultures and our traditions. Just think of our church and the culture of food that we have. We have enormous potlucks. We break bread over numerous occasions throughout the year. And even during Lent, we will gather on Wednesday nights to enjoy hot soups and delicious sandwiches. I dare say that we are doing more than just consuming food at these events. We are experiencing a very important dimension of church life, which is fellowship with Christian believers. We are talking with one another, and we're sharing our lives. We are offering care and love and comfort to one another. We do this for ourselves, and we also do it for the rest of our community. If you think that we are only serving fried chicken when a family shares a meal after a funeral, I invite you to expand your vision of what's going on there. Food is just a part of what is being shared. Are there certain foods that bring you comfort? Is there a particular dish, no matter where you are in the world, that when you smell it, see it, or taste it, it just transports you home? You can be escorted by a taste or smell. Perhaps it is Polly Lawrence's applesauce cake. Or maybe you're lucky enough to get a sample of one of Gary Cannon's fruitcakes during the holiday season. If so, count yourself lucky. Maybe you get a jar of Gladys's raspberry jam or Linda Ferris's zucchini chutney. My friend occasionally gives me a jar of her much coveted dill pickles. These foods compose a part of the story of who we are. And some of these foods are just as much a part of being home as actually being present in your family home or downstairs in the church fellowship hall. If you need help thinking about the traditional significance of food, just think about how odd it feels when you're not on church on Sunday to get that little piece of bread and the thimbleful of juice that we share at the Lord's Supper. We realize that consuming those small items is not really the entire point of the supper. We are receiving far more than physical sustenance with the Lord's Supper. And I tell you that it can happen around many types of food in many places of the world. We can have that sacrament of being in the presence of the Lord with one another. And so during Lent, we will consider the importance of food in our society and culture. Now, speaking of tradition, my good friend's family has a Friday evening tradition, and it is this. They all get out of the kitchen and they order pizza from a local pizza delivery place. And it is nearly sacramental, the importance of this. It is time together. Nobody's laboring, preparing food. Nobody has to really clean dishes or anything like that. And it's such a tradition that they call, and the place already knows their order. They just do it every Friday night. And everyone relaxes, and they enjoy one another's company. And they order enough so that they can enjoy some leftovers the next day. Or at least that's the plan. It turns out that as their boy grew up, so did his appetite. And he would stay up late on Friday night and get hungry again and go to the fridge and raid it and gobble up all the pizza. The rest of the family would get up the next day, maybe even for breakfast, and go to the refrigerator, and sometimes he would just leave an empty box in there with crust. And they experienced such disappointment that there were not enough leftovers for everybody. Well, her daughter got keen on this, and so one Friday night, before he could have his late night splurge, she went into the kitchen, got out the box of leftover pizza, and took one bite out of every slice in there so that she could have some of the leftovers. And you know what? Her mom didn't even get mad at her because she thought that's pretty resourceful, and she really made her point. Hey, don't take more than your fair share, brother. And so this story brings us to another dimension of what we'll be considering during Lent. How can we be good stewards of the food that we have? It astonishes me that American households average $1,500 a year of waste of food. $1,500 a year. It is estimated that nearly 30 to 40% of the food we have is wasted. We purchase food in bulk sometimes, and then we just can't consume it before it goes bad. Sometimes we're not very creative with our leftover food and we get tired of it and we toss it into the bin. Even restaurants and grocery stores put food that could be consumed by someone into dumpsters because there's not a good system for sharing and donating it and getting the food to the people who need it most. Indeed, we live in a land of plenty, but are we being good stewards of what our land produces? Some of you might think, well, I bought the food, and once I buy it, it's mine, and I can do with it whatever I want. And, well, that could be the case. Some might be hoarders of food. You buy more than what you need, and you stash it away, thinking, well, there might not be enough later, so I better go ahead and get it now. But I think Jesus would have us think a little more deeply about these situations. And I ask us to use our faith in Jesus to reason differently. Beyond just considering our personal access to food, don't we share some responsibility to being good stewards of the entire system? Shouldn't such a basic need for life be easier to access for all people? If the rich are the only ones that have access to good food, then what will happen to the poorest among us? Think about our stories in the Bible. There are so many stories that speak to this. There are stories about manna in the wilderness. And remember, the people could only receive their daily bread. They could not save it or hide it because it was designed to spoil before you could eat it the next day. And so they could only collect enough for a day and trust that there would be more. The only exception was the day before the Sabbath. They could collect a little bit more so that they wouldn't have to go out and labor the next day. I think about those in the wilderness with Jesus. They were there for 3 days. They had no access to food. But the scripture tells us that Jesus had compassion on them. They didn't have to pay for their food. They didn't have to work for it. They didn't even have to show that they deserved it. Jesus gave it to them, and Jesus gave it to them freely. And I don't mean just a morsel or a skimpy portion. We heard that there were baskets of leftovers after everyone had their fill. If we were to use this as our model, then we would realize there's no need to overconsume the pizza preemptively or to take bites out of it before other people get to it. There is always enough. God designed this system as a self-sustaining one. And if we are good caregivers, there is enough for everyone to be fed. As stewards of creation, we don't need to think of our resources as slices of pizza, where if someone gets more, then other people get less. There's already enough in our system. As people of faith, we can change the narrative that we have inherited from the larger culture, and that is the narrative of scarcity, the need to hoard resources, the notion that we've earned it and therefore it's ours and we can do with it whatever we want. Think about the doxology that we will sing in just a few minutes after collecting an offering. The words indicate that what we have was first God's, and we receive it with gratitude, and we are to use it with generosity toward others. The earth was created in this kind of system, so long as we are responsible caregivers. And guess who are the caregivers today? You're right, the body of Christ. It is us. If we take care of the earth, and if we work for responsible distribution of food and good use of the earth, then everyone will have enough. At the miracle of the feeding of the masses, not only do we not hear that people had to decline the invitation to eat because of dietary restrictions, but also we don't get the impression that someone ate a whole basket without passing it on, or that somebody else stuck fish away in his pockets for the walk home. We don't hear that someone took a bite out of a loaf of bread and then passed it on. We never hear anyone say, "No, thank you, Jesus. I'm all full of that." but I'd like to wait for dessert. No. In this story, there was enough. They shared the food. They ate with what we hope was gratitude, and they passed it along, ensuring that everybody had enough. And in God's great economy, there was some left over. May we learn from this story today. May we engage it over the next 5 weeks. And may we ask the question, what is our role in making sure that people have access to baskets and baskets of food? Thanks be to God.